What happens when a country's most important source of income simply stops? Not because a single bomb fell on it, but because every ship in the world suddenly refuses to come near it. That is exactly what is happening right now on a small island most people have never heard of, and the numbers behind it are almost hard to believe. Before we get into it, hit like on this video, subscribe, so you catch the next update the moment it happens. And share this with anyone who still thinks oil prices move for no reason at all. Let's start with the island itself, because nothing about this story makes sense until you understand exactly what it is. Kharg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, a small strip of coral and sand roughly 25 kilometers off Iran's southwestern coast. It is not a fortress. It does not look like a military stronghold. At its core, it is a loading terminal, a set of deep water jetties and pipelines built to move Iranian crude oil out of the ground and into the largest oil tankers on the planet. Here is the number that explains why this one small island matters more than almost anywhere else in this entire conflict. Roughly 90% of all the crude oil Iran sells to the rest of the world passes through Kharg first. Not most of it, not a large share of it. 9 out of every 10 barrels. Think about what that actually means for a government trying to keep itself funded during a war. Nearly the entire financial lifeline that pays for Iran's military, that keeps its currency from collapsing under the weight of years of sanctions, runs through pipelines connecting to loading arms on this single stretch of coastline. There is no meaningful backup sitting somewhere else, ready to absorb what Kharg normally moves in a single day, let alone a week. This is exactly why, for years, actually damaging Kharg was treated by American military planners as a line nobody wanted to cross. Not because it was technically difficult. Precision weapons can hit almost anything with enough planning. It was avoided because of what happens after. You do not just dent a government's budget for a season when you take out a terminal like this. You threaten to permanently change what a country can sell, to whom, and for how much, for years afterward. And that kind of shock does not stay contained inside one country's finances. It ripples straight into global oil markets, and global oil markets touch every single person checking a price sign at a gas station anywhere on the planet. For most of this war, that restraint held. Back in March, when American aircraft did strike the island, the targeting stayed narrow on purpose, hitting military storage facilities, mine depots, and missile systems, while leaving the oil terminal itself completely untouched. Iran's own state media confirmed as much at the time, reporting that the loading infrastructure suffered almost no damage and kept operating normally. That distinction was not an accident, it was policy, a deliberate line drawn between military targets and the economic engine of the country. So if the terminal was never actually bombed, what does gone overnight really mean? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because what has taken Kharg offline this month is not a missile. It is something quieter, and in some ways more effective. In mid-July, after a fragile understanding over the Strait of Hormuz completely collapsed, the United States reimposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. Warships took a position. Any vessel attempting to reach Kharg to load Iranian crude now has to get past that blockade first. And by the final days of July, satellite imagery and shipping data from multiple independent tracking firms showed something remarkable. No tankers were loading at Kharg at all. Not a reduced flow, not a slower trickle. Zero. The island's main export terminal sat completely empty, day after day, for more than a week straight, with a growing line of tankers idling offshore, unwilling or unable to come any closer. That is not a story about bombs falling from the sky. It is a story about fear, insurance, and risk, working together just as effectively as any airstrike could. Ship owners do not want their multi-million-dollar vessels anywhere near a blockade zone. Insurance companies do not want to underwrite a voyage into a war zone where naval forces are actively intercepting traffic. And crews certainly do not want to be the ones testing whether a warning shot turns into something worse. Put those three pressures together, and you get exactly what has happened at Kharg this month, a terminal that is fully intact, fully capable, and almost completely empty anyway. There is a principle worth holding on to here because it explains almost everything about how modern warfare actually squeezes an economy. You do not always need to destroy a factory to shut it down. Sometimes you just need to make everyone around it too afraid to walk through the front door. That is precisely what a blockade does. The machinery still works. The pipelines are still connected. The jetties are still standing exactly where they were built decades ago. But none of that matters if not a single tanker is willing to pull up alongside them. Quick pause here, because I want you to actually think about this with me for a second. If a country's entire oil export system can be shut down without a single explosion touching the terminal itself, what does that tell you about how fragile the whole system really is underneath all the noise of missiles and headlines? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and hit subscribe while you're at it so you do not miss what happens when Iran actually responds to this. Let's talk about why this blockade, rather than an actual strike, might end up being the more effective weapon of the two. When a country strikes physical infrastructure, there is a clear, visible before and after. Satellite images show craters. Engineers can begin repairs immediately, sourcing parts, welding pipes, rebuilding what was destroyed. It is painful, but it is a problem with a defined shape. A blockade is different. There's nothing to repair, because nothing is broken. The terminal is sitting there, fully functional, waiting, which means there is no clear timeline for when this ends, no obvious moment where reconstruction is complete and exports resume. It ends only when the political and military standoff itself ends, and nobody, not analysts, not traders, not Iran's own government, can currently say when that will be. That uncertainty is exactly what commodity markets fear more than almost anything else. You can plan around a known shortage. Refineries adjust, buyers find alternative suppliers, prices settle into a new normal. It is much harder to plan around a shortage with no confirmed end date attached to it at all, and that is the situation Kharg finds itself in right now. An economic asset worth billions of dollars a month, sitting completely idle, not because it was destroyed, but because nobody is currently willing to test whether trying to use it is worth the risk. Now let's talk about who is actually watching this most closely, because the answer might surprise you. It is not primarily European governments or American oil traders sitting glued to their screens over this. It is China. China has remained Iran's most consistent buyer of discounted crude throughout this entire war, purchasing oil at steep markdowns compared to global market rates, often through intermediaries, specifically designed to stay invisible to the kind of financial monitoring that would normally flag these transactions. With Kharg sitting empty, that flow has slowed dramatically, and Chinese refiners are reportedly tracking the situation with real attention this week, trying to work out whether this is a temporary disruption or something that stretches on for months. India's refiners, which have maintained smaller, quieter purchase arrangements with Iran, are running similar calculations behind closed doors, weighing whether to lock in alternative crude now or wait and see whether Kharg reopens. Here is the part of this story that reaches far beyond the Persian Gulf and lands directly in ordinary people's daily lives, whether they have ever heard of this island or not. When a terminal responsible for a meaningful share of global oil supply goes idle with no confirmed timeline for reopening, markets do not wait patiently for an official explanation before reacting. They price in the uncertainty, almost immediately, because uncertainty itself carries real financial weight. It is the inability to plan 3 months ahead with any confidence at all. We have watched this exact pattern play out before during earlier moments of tension in the same region, when prices moved within hours of satellite images being confirmed, long before any official assessment ever reached the public. Kharg is structurally different from a shipping lane that cargo can simply reroute around given enough notice. It is not a processing facility with a convenient backup sitting idle somewhere, ready to absorb the load the moment it is needed. Smaller terminals do exist elsewhere along Iran's coastline, at Bandar Imam Khomeini on the mainland, and on the smaller islands of Lavan and Siri. But none of them, even added together, come close to matching what Kharg alone is built to move in a single week. That chain of consequence reaches further than most people ever stop to consider. Gasoline prices connect to it, heating bills connect to it, shipping costs, import prices, the numbers printed on ordinary goods sitting on store shelves thousands of miles away from this conflict, all of it links back, through a long and often invisible pricing chain, to this narrow stretch of water and the island sitting inside it. If you came into this video assuming oil prices move purely on abstract supply and demand, completely separate from actual military decisions made in the middle of an active war, that assumption is being quietly reconsidered by markets right now, whether any government official ever says so out loud or not. Silence in moments like this is rarely nothing. It is often the sound of an entire market recalculating around a variable that simply was not part of its models a few weeks ago. So where does this actually go from here? Because a blockade like this does not end the underlying conflict. It forces Iran into a decision, and that decision is going to shape the next chapter of this war more than almost anything else happening right now. Broadly speaking, Iran has a handful of realistic paths available, and understanding each one is the only way to actually read what happens next with any real clarity. The first option is the one Iran has threatened publicly, repeatedly for months, a complete closure of the Strait of Hormuz to all commercial shipping, not selective harassment of specific vessels, but a total shutdown of marine traffic through the single most important energy choke point on the planet. This option carries enormous symbolic weight, and it is also the most complicated for Iran to actually follow through on, for a reason its own leadership understands perfectly well. Closing Hormuz entirely does not only hurt Iran's adversaries, it cuts off Iran's own remaining export routes as well, including the very alternative pathways any future economic recovery would eventually depend on. It also risks turning every government in the wider Gulf region, including some that have stayed quietly sympathetic to Iran throughout this war, into direct victims of a decision made entirely by Tehran. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that strait on an ordinary day. Closing it does not just escalate a regional standoff, it risks converting Iran's global image almost overnight from a country under pressure into a country actively causing a worldwide economic emergency. The second realistic option is a smaller, more targeted response, something that inflicts real economic pain without triggering the kind of total catastrophe a full closure of Hormuz would guarantee. We have already seen smaller strikes on regional energy infrastructure move oil prices measurably within hours during this conflict. A more limited Iranian response against a specific commercial target somewhere in the Gulf would be smaller in scale than shutting down Hormuz completely, but it would let Iran keep escalating this conflict on its own timeline, rather than reacting purely to decisions made in Washington. And controlling that timeline, even partially, carries real strategic value entirely on its own. The third option is something analysts have started calling the pivot and price strategy. Iran shifts whatever export capacity it can toward its smaller terminals, the mainland facility at Bandar Imam Khomeini, and the loading points on Lavan and Siri Islands. None of these, even combined, can fully replace what Kharg alone is capable of moving. But together, they represent a meaningful fraction of that volume, enough to keep some revenue flowing while the standoff around Kharg continues. Russia, which has spent years building its own workaround logistics for exporting sanctioned oil, becomes an even more useful partner under this scenario. The oil keeps moving, just slower, cheaper, and through longer, more complicated routes than before. The fourth option generates the least noise in the short term, and it may carry the most significant long-term consequences of all, which is exactly why it deserves careful attention. Iran deepens its support for the network of regional partners it has spent decades building and arming. Under this approach, Iran essentially converts an oil revenue problem into a leverage problem instead. The underlying message becomes simple and blunt. You cannot fully shut down what I am capable of doing without confronting every single network I currently support, and confronting all of them costs far more than whatever you gained by squeezing one island's exports. This is not a new strategy for Iran. It is one the country has leaned on for decades, and a blockade that removes a large share of its cash income does not necessarily make this approach less attractive to its leadership. In some ways, it makes it more attractive, because it shifts Iran's remaining leverage away from an economic asset it no longer fully controls, toward a form of pressure it still controls completely. That is the counterintuitive risk sitting quietly underneath this entire situation, one that planners in Washington have to weigh very carefully. Weakening a government economically does not automatically reduce its willingness to use force elsewhere. In some cases, it does the exact opposite. If you're still with me at this point, you clearly want the full picture instead of the surface-level version, so do me a favor and hit that share button right now, and send this to someone who thinks this whole story is just about a strait and a few tankers, because it is actually about something much bigger playing out in real time. Let's zoom out for a moment, because looking at this blockade in complete isolation risks making it seem more decisive than the reality on the ground actually is. This is without question one of the most economically significant developments this entire conflict has produced. A major oil exporter effectively cut off from loading a single barrel at its primary terminal for over a week straight. But it is not, by itself, a knockout blow that strips Iran of its ability to act, to threaten, or to sustain the networks it has spent 4 decades building. Iran's government has survived earlier waves of sanctions that effectively cut it off from large parts of the global banking system. It has survived years of sustained military pressure throughout this current war. Pressure of this kind adds a serious new category of consequence to the ledger, but it does not automatically end the story on its own. The real question this moment forces is not whether the blockade represents a serious setback. It clearly does. The real question is whether this specific pressure pushes Iran's leadership toward a negotiating position it had previously refused to seriously consider, or whether it strips away enough of what the country has left to lose that its leadership calculates there is simply less remaining reason to hold anything back. Those two outcomes can look nearly identical from the outside for the first several days after a moment like this one. They tend to look very different weeks later, once the initial shock wears off and actual decisions start showing up in how each side behaves on the ground. There are a few specific things worth watching closely from here, because they will tell you far more than any official statement from either government ever could. Watch whether Iran begins visibly ramping up activity at its smaller export terminals in ways that show up clearly on commercial satellite tracking. If Tehran makes a public show of running its mainland facility or its island terminals at higher capacity, that is a strong signal the pivot and price strategy is already underway, and that the government has chosen quiet economic survival over immediate military escalation as its first real response. Watch whether China says anything official at all about disruption to its Iranian oil supply arrangements. Beijing, staying silent on this particular question, will likely tell you more about the private conversations happening behind closed doors than any formal statement either government eventually makes public. And watch the actual ship movement. Data through the Strait of Hormuz, not the political statements surrounding it, but the raw commercial tracking numbers that maritime intelligence firms publish daily. Those numbers will reveal whether Iran is quietly applying its own counterpressure on commercial shipping, and that kind of pressure often shows up in the data well before any official Iranian response is ever announced out loud. Every one of those threads connects back to the same underlying question sitting at the heart of this entire story. For weeks, the blockade sat there, tightening slowly, giving Iran's leadership time to calculate exactly how much pain it could absorb before something had to change. What this moment actually proves is not that Iran has been defeated, and it is not that this war is anywhere close to a conclusion. What it proves is that a threshold has quietly been crossed, the threshold protecting a government's core economic lifeline from being cut off entirely, even without a single missile touching the terminal itself. Restraint around that threshold existed for a reason, because crossing it means accepting economic fallout that becomes extremely difficult to contain once it starts spreading outward into global markets. That restraint no longer holds the same way it once did. Every government in the region is now quietly recalculating what the United States is actually prepared to do once it decides the cost of holding back outweighs the cost of taking action. And every government watching from outside the region, with no direct stake in this particular conflict, but plenty of stake in global energy prices, is running that exact same calculation right now, in real time, whether they say so publicly or not. Let's slow down on one part of this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves: the actual mechanics of how a blockade like this squeezes a government from the inside out. Oil revenue for a country under this level of sanction pressure has never flowed through simple, visible channels. It moves through intermediaries, sold at steep discounts compared to global benchmark prices, routed through networks specifically built to stay invisible to the kind of financial monitoring that Western governments use to track sanctioned trade. Even operating under those constrained, secretive conditions, Kharg was still moving oil every single day right up until the blockade tightened. Not at the volumes Iran once exported before sanctions truly took hold years ago, not at the prices Iran commanded before this war even started. But enough, consistently enough, to keep the government's operational budget from collapsing outright. Enough to help fund the military campaigns and support networks that have defined this conflict from its very first days. The real question now is not whether Iran lost something strategically significant when that flow stopped. It clearly did. The harder question is exactly what fraction of Iran's current operating revenue was moving through this terminal at the precise moment the blockade fully took hold. And even analysts with access to the best satellite imagery and financial tracking data available are genuinely uncertain about that number right now. What is not uncertain is who is watching most closely and what they are quietly preparing to do if this drags on for months rather than weeks. Think about the position this puts ordinary tanker crews in, people who did not choose this war and did not make any of the decisions that led here. Somewhere in the waters near the Persian Gulf right now, dozens of ships are simply sitting, engines idling, crews waiting for word on whether it is safe to move closer or safer to hold position exactly where they are. They are managing the consequences of decisions made in capitals thousands of miles away, the same way every crew connected to this conflict has been doing for months now, mostly without recognition, mostly without their names ever appearing anywhere near a headline. That is the part of this story that rarely gets told with the weight it actually deserves. Not the satellite images, not the market charts moving in real time, but the ordinary people on tankers and at refineries and standing at gas pumps thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, absorbing the consequences of a standoff they never asked to be any part of. There is also a steelman worth considering here. The strongest version of the argument that this blockade might matter less than it appears to right now. Iran has weathered serious economic pressure before and kept functioning. Its government has proven more than once that it can operate under conditions that would collapse most other economies within months. Smaller terminals, however limited, do provide some cushion. Russia and China have both shown a willingness to help Iran move oil through workaround channels when the price is right. None of that means this blockade is painless, but it does mean declaring this the moment that finally forces Iran's hand would be getting ahead of what the evidence actually shows so far. Iran has surprised outside observers with its capacity to endure pressure before, and a fair analysis has to hold space for the possibility that it does so again here, at least for a while longer than markets currently expect. But here's the honest complication sitting underneath that steelman. Every previous round of pressure Iran successfully absorbed still allowed some meaningful flow of oil revenue to continue somewhere in the system. This blockade, for the first time in years, has pushed that flow at the country's single most important terminal down to genuinely zero for a sustained stretch of time. That is a different category of pressure than anything the government has had to absorb in recent memory, and treating it as simply more of the same risks, underestimating exactly how unusual this moment actually is. All right. If you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Someone who wants the full mechanics behind a headline, not just the headline itself. Do me one favor, hit that notification bell after you subscribe. Because when Iran actually makes its move here, and it will, you're going to want to know within hours, not days. Let's talk about what history actually tells us about moments like this one, because it rarely offers clean, comfortable answers. Economic pressure on a government does not move in a straight line toward either surrender or collapse. It moves toward whichever outcome that government's leadership believes best preserves its own survival, and that calculation does not always match what outside analysts expect or predict. Somewhere tonight, in planning rooms modeling exactly this kind of economic trajectory, analysts on more than one side of this conflict are running precisely this calculation, trying to figure out whether they are watching a government being pressured toward the negotiating table or a government being cornered into a position where further escalation becomes the only path that preserves its legitimacy at home. History does not offer a reliable rule about which kind of pressure tends to produce which kind of outcome. That uncertainty is worth carrying with you as the next few weeks actually unfold. What we do know, right now, with real confidence, is this. A country that built nearly its entire export economy around a single narrow strip of coastline just watched that coastline go quiet, not because of a missile, but because the world simply stopped showing up. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what happens next, because it means there is no rebuilding process to point to, no visible repair timeline anyone can track on a calendar. There is only the standoff itself, continuing for exactly as long as both sides calculate that continuing serves their interests better than backing down does. An island like this does not need walls or soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder along its coastline to stay protected. For decades, it needed something else entirely. The simple fact that touching it directly was considered too costly for anyone to seriously attempt. That protection did not end with an explosion this time. It ended quietly, with warships taking up position and tankers deciding one by one that the risk was no longer worth it. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon in a conflict like this is not the one that makes the loudest sound. It is the one that makes an entire industry decide, on its own, without needing to be told twice, that showing up simply is not worth the risk anymore. Somewhere tonight, in a household far from any headline about this island, someone is quietly checking an oil price dashboard, trying to understand what those numbers mean for decisions they need to make before the week is out, a heating bill, a fuel budget, a business that depends on shipping costs staying predictable. They were not planning for a small island in the Persian Gulf to be part of that equation. Almost nobody outside a very small circle of analysts and traders was, but that is exactly what happens, quietly and without fanfare, in every economy connected even loosely to this stretch of water. A standoff playing out thousands of miles away reshapes the numbers everyone else has to work with, whether they ever learn the name of the island responsible for it or not. This story is far from finished, and the real answer to everything we have walked through today will not come from a press release or a political statement. It will come from what Iran's leadership actually chooses to do on the water in the days and weeks ahead, not the rhetoric surrounding it. Do they hold the line and let the pressure keep building, betting that outside patience runs out before their own does? Do they pivot hard toward smaller terminals and quieter workaround routes, accepting a smaller flow of revenue in exchange for keeping some cash moving? Do they escalate somewhere else entirely, converting an oil problem into a leverage problem the way they have done before? Or does the pressure finally push toward the kind of negotiating position that has been sitting untouched on the table for months, waiting for exactly this kind of moment to make it suddenly look more attractive than it did before? Those paths look almost identical from the outside in the first few days after a moment like this one. They rarely stay that way for long, and whichever path Iran actually takes, the ripple effects will not stay contained to the Persian Gulf. They will show up in gas prices, in shipping costs, in the quiet arithmetic that businesses and households everywhere are already running, whether they realize the source of it or not. What happened at Kharg this month is not really a story about one island or even about one government's oil revenue. It is a story about how fragile the systems holding up daily life for billions of people actually are underneath the surface. How a handful of warships and a wave of nervous insurance underwriters can accomplish, quietly, what years of missiles and sanctions sometimes could not. A complete halt, achieved not through destruction, but through fear alone. That is worth sitting with long after this video ends. Think back to where this whole story started. An island protected for decades not by walls or soldiers, but by the simple fact that touching it seemed too costly to seriously attempt. That old kind of protection is gone now. What replaced it is stranger and, in its own way, more effective. Nobody had to fire a shot at the terminal itself. They only had to make an entire shipping industry quietly agree, tanker by tanker, insurer by insurer, that this particular risk was no longer worth taking. If that is what modern economic warfare actually looks like, then the real lesson of this story is not about one island at all. It is about how much of the world's daily stability rests on decisions made by people who never appear in a single headline. Captains, underwriters, cargo owners, each one making a quiet, individual calculation that adds up to something enormous once you step back far enough to see the whole picture. Because the next time a headline mentions an island you have never heard of, thousands of miles from wherever you happen to be watching this, remember that the numbers on your own receipts, your own bills, your own household budget, might already be quietly responding to it before you ever read a single word about why.